Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 82 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here with Curt and Jerry today to go on to part 3 of our structuring a trauma-informed transformation process. So I thought this might be one episode, but here we are at part 3. So if you're just jumping in and joining us for the first time, highly suggest you go back at least 2 episodes to episode 80, so you're not too lost where we're picking up this discussion. Because today, so just to review sort of our journey so far, we start out talking about training and the importance of sort of the trauma-informed piece of this journey and implementing these principles into our practice. Using assessments and other things, Jerry talked a lot about, which I think is great, is create trauma-informed principles to guide your journey, really trying to find that starting point. Then look at creating a team, getting the right people at the table to really do a lot of this work, because if you're going to review policies and procedures and practices, that's not something that's going to happen in a couple hours. Like I said, we can't even talk about a skeleton for this process in less than 3 hours. So that gives you some idea about some of the time this takes. And so today we want to sort of bring this all together. As I mentioned throughout, I've been also writing some blog posts based on a book that might be out in a few months. We'll see. It's coming together on how I sort of look at structuring this, especially for schools. But I think if you you can go to the blog tab at traumainformedlens.org. You'll see Matt's Mumbling's blog and can find all those there. But really trying to help people get concrete about this. A lot of folks go to a training and they want to do a lot of stuff. But again, a lot of this takes some planning, patience, and strategy as well. So we'll sort of dive in to this overall structure a little bit, but also throw in the implementation measurement part of this journey as well. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And I'll start us out this week because I had a fun experience. I got to go to Glenwood Springs, Colorado for a training with Youth Zone, who does a lot of work in that area for our state. And, you know, I love Colorado because there's such, Glenwood Springs in the spring where everything's green and beautiful. If you've never been there, I believe it's the most beautiful stretch of interstate. You go through this really intense high canyon. I-70 just goes right through it. I'm amazed every time I drive on I-70. Then after I do it, I kind of wish they didn't build an interstate through that canyon. But boy, is it an amazing thing. And when I came out for the first time to visit Colorado and explore it, I ended up in Glenwood Springs, and it just kind of like, it's fun to go back 19 years later and have some of those memories while doing a training with a great group of folks as well. So shout out to any new listeners we have from Youth Zone, and thanks for a wonderful, beautiful trip. It was fun to get energized by the people and the beauty of that area as well. So, Curt, what's your bright, shiny object for the week this week?
Basketball.
Yeah, Nuggets. Come on, Nuggets.
Basketball. I mean, my team is the Jazz, and they're out, and that was a quick sweep, but it's still fun that they made the playoffs. And then number 2, of course, is the Nuggets, and I'm real excited about that. I was watching the game last night, and while I've been watching the games, I've been working on a conference presentation and thinking a lot about metaphors and how metaphors are so important for helping us to understand things. And eventually, like, we get better understanding, we get new metaphors to understand whatever phenomena is happening, right? And then the old metaphor is hard to give up. But I was watching about how useful they are and kind of tying it back to what we're talking about. And I remember reading the original article about the drama triangle written by Steve Karpman. This is what, 1968, I think. And he developed the idea of the drama triangle by watching basketball. And by watching the ball be passed around to get around the defense. And that's how he came up with, oh, it's like relationships work like that. Like we're just passing the ball back and forth. And that's how he came up with the idea of the drama triangle. And I was like, oh, the idea of metaphors to help us to understand things is a bright, shiny object. I love them. And I think they're really helpful in when you're presenting complex ideas to other people or trying to understand something yourself. A metaphor can be really helpful for that. And I love being able to watch basketball. And I think of that now often when I'm watching basketball games or even hockey games. I mean, you could look at it, in that way as well, that of watching how that kind of passing the ball back and forth between different points of contact on a team. Yeah. I just love sport. I think I love the competition aspect of things and watching the effort that people put forth. I always love that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and my Pacers lost, so the Nuggets are number 2. It's nice to have that backup bandwagon, though. When this goes live, our audience will know, well, at least the ones that care, whether they were able to win Game 7. So fingers crossed, their bench decided not to show up for Game 6. So.
Maybe we'll be bonded over that for the next 2 months.
I know. Everybody will become basketball fans in Colorado if they win. So we'll see what happens. Jerry, what's going on with you this week?
This week I'm getting into, I'm going to take a 5-day immersion course in October with Diane Fosha on her affect psychotherapy. And it's been interesting in the last, really, since I started to reread her work and get prepared to kind of take this course, is to watch how people manage their emotions, right? Is that in our culture, emotions have a strange part in some ways. We're not supposed to have emotions in meetings, right? We're not supposed to, as we have these discussions today. And so we flip between trying to over-control ourselves to when they do come up, they come up in this kind of way that's not very productive. And so I think of watching, I was with a group the other day, and really this group did a really good job of getting in touch with lots of feelings. The work that they do around working with vulnerable people who have lots of emotional injuries, they end up holding a lot of feelings. And how healing it was for them to just get in a spot and share some of that. And that the 2 supervisors of this group did such a fantastic job of holding a space where there was both some safety to have some feelings, but also some structure and norms about how to manage that piece. And really how healing it is for people to actually not have to defend against their emotions, but to have a place to, in some ways, to let that healing process occur by being able to manage your emotions. So that, I think as we talk today, there's a lot of, as you put it, concrete things you have to do. But there's also a lot of emotional work that has to happen, right? Which changes it from just a meeting to a trauma-informed meeting. And I think that this balance between feeling and being in touch with it, relating, and then getting the work done.
Yeah.
Right? That's the and I think that I've observed groups that are very tasky and in some ways can't create that sense of trust and safety and to do it. The other ones who are very emotional and get flooded and don't get a lot of work done. But sitting in a group that really found a balance this week, it is possible, and it's really a nice thing to observe. So I left feeling more energized by the process.
Great. Well, and I think that's a great jumping off point as well. So again, with the blog post series, and I believe the first two parts of this discussion too, we talk about, so again, we started with the training, which really gives us the trauma-informed piece of that. And then really at that point, so much of this, as Jerry brings up, is done by teams. And one of the things that I've really paid a lot of attention to, whether as a consultant, but also in my research and developing my own self as leaders, is so many of these processes get sidetracked by our inability to bring people together in a healthy way. And let me, I would just like to get your opinions on what Jerry was talking about with that management of feelings and emotions within a team context, especially when we're talking about maybe changing and putting a trauma-informed lens and to maybe a critical lens on practices that we've done sometimes for decades and are pretty well ingrained in how we feel safe in our work and how we define our work and our values. So it's just a question that came up with Jerry, maybe a little off topic, but I think it's okay to ask this. Is one of the things I really struggled with early on in my trauma journey was the idea of community meetings. And these have a lot of different characteristics, many of which I think I integrate into the blog post. But one is that they started out every meeting checking in with everybody of where they were at emotionally. And I would just love to get your opinion, because on one hand, I love the idea of, hey, if you had a sick kid at home and you got 3 hours of sleep, it's good for me as the leader to know you had 3 hours of sleep. And yet, as kind of Jerry said, I saw this oftentimes disrail entire meetings and made people hate. I saw this a lot early on, made people really hate anything about trauma because they thought, oh God, are those meetings I have to go to where I have to talk about my emotions every time before we do anything? So I would wonder, when you guys think about balancing through change processes, sort of the emotional, the affective part of these change when we're looking at hard things, what are some strategies? We've talked about this in general, but what might be some concrete strategies you utilize to balance getting things done, but also bringing everybody along emotionally with that journey as well?
Maybe I can give an example from yesterday.
Perfect. Perfect.
So yesterday, where was I? I was at a residential treatment center, and I was doing a training on applied behavior analysis, evidence-based practices for traumatized children. Right, so it was a very task-oriented meeting, right? I was presenting very specific information that's very detailed and very structured. And I got done with the training and, of course, asked, are there questions? What do you guys think? What are your reactions? And the conversation, this is with a group of lead staff and direct care staff. And the conversation very quickly turned to, well, how do we get along with the school better? Or how do we get along with those outside of our organization better? Nothing, almost nothing to do with it. Although the topic generated it, right? The topic generated because they were trying to do certain practices that other people didn't know about or didn't agree with, and it generated some conflict. So it all very quickly went to some feelings that got generated when they felt like people weren't on the same page, right? We hadn't achieved same pageness or the consistency that they wanted. So it really quickly went to, how do we manage conflict? And I think maybe it was the thing to do. I'll find out later, following up with the group, whether or not this was effective or not. But I think the strategy I attempted to use was to put their feelings into context, and to also to use the therapeutic term, to normalize it, right? To talk about, and I could let the group borrow a little bit of my experience working in the field for a while anyway, that the conflict between any part of an organization that has some kind of either time separation between contacts with people in a department or geographical separation, like any of those kinds of things, start to increase the barriers to communication, and will infer intent on the part of other people, often when there isn't that intent, right? Our brains do that. And part of it is we do that naturally. And part of it is that we do it as a part of what we learned as young children. Like that's a part of our world. And so they very quickly started to infer intent on the part of other departments, that it was that the other department didn't like them, or that they were mad at them, or like, all of these feelings, right, get generated. And so we had a conversation about conflict between school and res. It's existed for as long as I have been working in the field. And Jerry, I'm sure you could attest to further back than I can attest, that the division between school and res all the time. And school teachers will tell you the division between home and school. It exists everywhere we go because of physical separation. And so we talked about that. And then we even talked about, I brought it up to him, just lucky because I've lived this for a lot of years. I said, what about the front end of the week and the back end of the week? Do you have conflict between those two shifts? And they're like, oh yeah, we didn't even think about that. And I was like, what about overnight and morning staff? And they were like, oh yeah. So we talked about how normal it is for us to be in this situation, for it to generate certain emotional reactions, that we might feel confused. We might feel angry sometimes. We might feel frustrated sometimes. We might feel like we're not getting the right information. And to think about, they kept wanting to go towards, well, if we could all do the same thing and have consistency all the time, that's what we want. And that was a great point in the conversation, because that was the point where they were really starting to think about how to solve the problem, right? And their solution was consistency. And that was a point that I could kind of challenge that idea a little bit and say, well, each one of you is an individual who can bring some creativity to this process. And we want that, don't we? Like we want a balance between structure and predictability and consistency and creativity. And
no, Curt, we want everybody needs to be consistent with us.
Sure.
I like that theory.
So that's just what I do
with my thinking and actions.
So we talked about the ideas of task-oriented conflict, and that's a good thing, that anytime we're going to get creativity, we have to have some conflict, even for ourselves, right? It doesn't have to be conflict between two people. If we become creative, it's because there's some conflict between how we're operating and a problem that we need to solve, and that we have to find a solution to a problem that's causing some kind of conflict for us. And so that it's always going to exist, and we've got to learn how to manage it and recognize when it's productive and when it's not productive. Mm-hmm. So it went from talking about how they felt about something back to a task-oriented kind of discussion. And that just seemed to work well in that instance. Maybe I'll find out if it was effective for them later. But the conversation was great. And those were just some kind of strategies that I used yesterday.
Well, and I think that one of the key things, acknowledging that emotions play into part of this process. There's frustration, but and I think this is really difficult, and we've got to get things done, and I think, that hopefully we can position emotions. And when I talk about larger leadership context, is I like to think about being pulled or being pushed. And I think things like greater vision, if we can envision why we're doing this, whether it's becoming trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, whatever language we want to use, providing better services. I think this is where that we'll touch on sometime in this discussion too, where outcomes and data actually play a key role, where we can quantify some progress there. But it's not like I said, not an easy thing. And I think so many groups get stuck and then too many leaders want to force through things, which might get you to a conclusion, but doesn't give you a whole lot of support once you leave the room with folks. Jerry, I'd love to get your thinking on this.
Well, my first thought is, isn't it really much easier to talk about the conflict in the school or in the world than it is to talk about the conflict in the room?
Yeah.
Right? Is that, we've talked about this, Curt, before. It's like, how do you let people get out of the room, right? How do you talk about how they're managing things there, when I would bet that there's kind of disagreements right in the room, right? But it's part of working with trauma is we've got to circle our wagons and we've got to be our group and we've got to kind of look at that. And then there's an outside group, right? And I think that's why in these treatment centers you tend to get these conflicts, is it's really hard to hold what people are feeling, right? So in a way, it's the perfect dynamic for us to kind of come together, suppress some of our conflicts, and then have somebody outside as the enemy as to kind of look at that. But I think the dynamic in if we're talking about schools is that, and this happens in treatment centers, there's this push, right, to say all kids should be, no matter what's going on, they should all be in the classroom, which was a really great kind of belief, right? Everybody's equal, and why separate them and put them in other classrooms and make them feel somehow that, there's something wrong with them. Let's put them all back in the classroom. Very similar feeling of let's get all the people out of the institutions and put them back out in the community, right? Well, what we know is if the community isn't well resourced and trained, those people end up being homeless. And I think that lots of these kids that we put back in the classrooms without doing this trauma understanding and really looking at policies and procedures and how we do things ends up in these kids becoming emotionally homeless in school. They get kicked out of class, they get kicked out because we really haven't prepared the community to manage the change that we thought was a good thing. So I think that in treatment centers, we put all of these kids that are having these difficulties with young professionals, and then we ask them to kind of manage this situation that nobody could manage prior to it. But we really don't give them the resources, the support to kind of do. We just kind of put them in there, and then what's the solution is we get all this conflict, or we get physically aggressive. So I think the whole purpose of having this discussion around trauma-informed practice is how can we, in some ways, prepare the community for the change that we're asking them to make. Not just put them into the old classroom, the old way it is, with this one teacher who's going to be dependent on herself, that doesn't have support and supervision and whatever that looks like. And then have all these kids that used to be in other classrooms, now they're in her classroom or in his classroom, and they're supposed to handle it. And by the way, you're supposed to have a good attitude and feel really good and kind of be able to manage it. So I think this discussion, Matt, about, in a way, looking at policies and procedures and stopping and creating is about how do we change our community to really match what we believe is that all people have a right to be accessing all of these resources and kind of look at that. And I think it's a microcosm of a larger community.
Yeah.
Is that we never stopped as a larger community and said, what do we do with all these people that we took out of institutions and how do we really make a space in our community for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So That's how I see schools is we just created homeless students.
That's a great analogy. And yeah. And I think the other thing, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, because I think, Jerry, when you bring up that community piece, I think one of the things that people, this is a very kind of non-bulk concrete thing, but I think this is something people need to think about before they do this, is for most organizations, and I would say for the vast majority of organizations more than just a couple people big, usually have a team, and that's where the blog post goes into a lot of detail about creating that team, setting that team up for success, that sort of does a lot of the work, that kind of does this work of policy review. And some organizations that are larger might have multiple teams going. But then I think there's this other thing as we kind of reach the end of this journey to some extent today, is that team's doing the work, and then that team needs to integrate their work into the larger organizational community as well. Because I see, like with my wife in education, that her school's going through exactly the example Jerry talked about, where they're pushing kids that really sometimes would go to even alternative schools because the district would not be able to provide them resources. They're now pushing those kids back into your average classroom, which again, I think there's a lot philosophically really good about that. And hopefully practically it will be successful. But I also think it sets up this interesting dynamic where the district is telling my wife without any input into the process that this is going to happen. In other words, we're going to disrupt your class, your typical way your classroom runs, not the kids disrupting it, but we're going to put a whole different student in your classroom who has different needs, different approaches for that student to be successful behaviorally and academically. And yeah, we're going to give you a little bit of support, but I think it's a good example of how if I'm not involved in any of the decision making, then I feel like people are forcing me. And that's where I think you get a lot of that resistance. As we talk about in MI, if you're telling me I have to act and I haven't had a chance to contemplate and prepare, then at worst I'm going to see you as an enemy. At best, I'm just going to have some resistance and pushback. And so I think that this is, again, it's a very nuts and bolts thing, but we often bring in teams to work on specific issues. And if we don't think about how that team operates in a larger community, we often then go back and tell people, okay, you're going to do this different without getting a whole lot of input there as well.
So Matt, there's a good example is there's not a shared mental model, right? So there's not only is there not input, but your wife and the other teachers and whatever really don't, in some ways, say what kind of changes do we need to make in our school in how we function in order to successfully have this accomplished, right? I'm going to put this student in, I'm going to disrupt it, and then you're going to figure out how to manage this within the current, as opposed to let's all get in a room and have some training and some thoughts about how we can make this environment prepare to have this kind of change.
Yeah.
Right? So I think this happens all the time. Let's just get kids out of residential care and put them in the community. The reason the kids are in residential care is the community couldn't tolerate these kids.
Right?
Now we're going to put them back there, and really it's really well intended.
Right.
That belief. It's like kids should just be in the community. But if you don't do the work to prepare it, you get the same reaction. Mm-hmm. Those kids are going to go someplace else, and oftentimes it's to the street.
Yeah,
it's really indicative of often how decision making starts to evolve, right? That if one thing is good, then more of it must be better. Right? That kind of an idea, right? Because you think years ago, right? People were like, "Oh my goodness, look at the problem that this one kid caused in this community. We need to protect the community, so let's put a whole bunch of them in residential treatment." But maybe that wasn't the right thing for all of them.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we put them all in there, and now we're like, well, maybe that's not the right thing for all of them. Let's take them all out. Right? But it's good for some. It's not good for all.
Yeah.
Same with being in the community. It's good for some, like the community can't handle all of it.
Yeah.
And so we just see it almost like Cartman's drama triangle, right? Where attention goes from different points of contact and we just collect around it and then jump to the next one.
So I guess today, really, Matt, is the process isn't going to work right.
Yeah.
Right? But what can schools or what could programs do to better prepare themselves to be able to manage this change that's happening outside of their control?
Yeah.
We can kind of get angry and kind of get frustrated and indirectly attack the kid that's going to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could set up this what you're talking about, this process, so that how do we change the way we do things to better see this as successful?
Yeah. Well, and I think, if you just look at some of the examples we've thrown out is, and this kind of goes back to episode 1 of this 3-part series is, that's where I think the training, so much of this, because obviously this is happening in my wife's school, so I'm not involved in it. But, when somebody comes in and tells you we're going to change our philosophy on things, I think there's probably not a quicker way you can lose somebody's buy-in to a process than, hey, the philosophy we've been doing is wrong. What you've been doing is wrong, and we're going to tell you how to do it right. So I think the good thing about Trauma Informed and this whole movement is training's been really central to it overall. And I don't think a whole lot of organizations say, hey, we're just going to train a team and have them do this in isolation. And then creating that, again, kind of the step 2 of the process is finding that starting point. How do we use assessments? Again, we talked about that start, stop, continue, change, really easy facilitation process piece of it. So I think we set it up there hopefully in a positive way, because I think a lot of times we just bring a group together or tell a group they're going to do things different ways, and now you guys need to figure this out is, that sets up teams, I think, in a place where they can't really succeed. So I think just thinking this through, slowing down a little bit, which is such a big part of trauma-informed care as well. The other piece I'd like to throw in here, because I do think it's an important, is the role of quality improvement and data. Because a part of this, I think it's difficult, is that really what we hope is that if you implement certain scientifically based approaches and change your lens and change your policies and procedures, that the outcomes you're already measuring will improve. That to me in some ways is the big goal. But, on the other hand, I think everybody really wants data. Show me this works. And the hard thing was saying, okay, well, if I come in and say, well, your overall things you're already measuring should improve over the next couple of years, it's hard to kind of, as we say in the research place, it's hard to kind of isolate that this is the variable that caused that change. So I kind of wonder, like you're all's thinking, when you think about measuring progress along a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive or trauma-responsive journey, what do you look to measure? What sort of outputs are you looking for to show that that an organization or program is being successful along this journey? What are some pieces of feedback that we might be able to measure or look at to see improvement along the process?
There are so many of them, Matt. Like that's a really big question, I think. And here's why I think it's big. And maybe I'm thinking that it's bigger than it really is, right? But
I think it's big too. I would agree with you. Yeah.
So when you think about what we measure, that should be linked to what we value, right? And that changes with every single culture. So to think about that, and I know people develop training programs and performance measures and quality measures as a part of organizational change, and what are the kind of key measures. And I think that there are some things there to look at and go, do we like this measure? Do we like what somebody did here? Do we like this? But I think that should be a part of the process of developing your change process. Actually, I think that deciding what you value and what to measure is an important one. And then one of the reasons why I firmly believe that, and haven't all of my career, right? Early in my career, I was much more like, there's a way to do this, and there's like a protocol, and I've had a lot of those edges knocked off over the years, hopefully in a positive way. The real value of data, I think, is to change the way that discussions happen within teams. There are many, many teams that have meetings and discussions about opinions, which is great. Like, we should share our opinions and talk about them. But it's so much more productive to have opinions about how we understand a set of facts. And that's what data gives you. Right? It's some kind of potentially factual information. I'll hedge on that a little bit, but at least frames a discussion. So we can say, what do we think about this data? What do we think about this information? How do we understand this problem based on this information? And it can be a really helpful way of creating a task for a group to be organized around that helps with this problem of, there are some groups that are incredibly task oriented and don't ever talk about feelings, and feelings get acted out in those teams frequently. And then there are other teams that only talk about feelings and never get anything done. And you've got a management problem either way. And I have found this has worked really well for me, that having data helps me to manage that problem. It's a really good tool that I can use to help to manage that. There are some times when we're being really task oriented and we're just looking at a problem and it doesn't seem like we're getting to it. And I can go, well, what do we think about this information? Or how do we feel about this information? And I can start to frame a discussion about what the affect that's happening in the group. And then there are other times when we're only talking about feelings. And I can go, well, what do we think about that fact? Let's talk about that fact over there, and organize the group to be focused on a task then. And I've used that to shift a group either way on that, it happens all the time.
Yeah. Jerry, you once hired me to help measure at an organization you were running. So
that was not the best decision I ever made.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that fact now, Jerry?
I could have hired you for a lot of things. Hiring you for that was not the best decision.
I met with you where you were at developmentally, though.
That's fair. That's fair. That's a fair comment.
That was a really good comeback, Matt.
Yeah, that was good.
That was really good comeback.
To kind of look at that. So, what is the question here, Matt?
What's the role of data? And I do want to address the specifics, because I think Curt gives us a context. But a lot of people, when they take the trauma journey, so to speak, and go through this change process, a lot of times this might be funded by grants or other things that want really concrete information about how their investment, or an organization wants to know what their investment, how does that impact our outcomes? How do we prove success of this initiative? Which I think is a great question to ask, but when you're trying to change a philosophy and practices as well, I think it gets tricky. So that's sort of the main question. I know that's a complex one, but I'm sure you've been asked that in the past as well, Jerry.
I'll answer that at my developmental level that I'm currently to kind of look at that, and then Curt can put it into some more sophisticated manner. But what I see oftentimes with groups, organizations, is that there's a separation between somebody writing a grant and writing some outcomes and the team and how they think about things. So when you put this data on the table and you bring it to the group says, that doesn't match any way I'm thinking about it, right? Doesn't help me. So I really think that there's, in some ways, there has to be some discussion about what do we believe is going on and what do we believe we need to change, right? And then we need to then have data give some feedback to the group about how they're doing, so that there's a shared model that the data is somewhat giving them feedback on, right? Because even in my golf game, when I'm playing golf, having feedback is really helpful to me, right? Is that if I have some type of external way for me to know how fast my club is moving or the direction of my face on the club, that's really helpful to me, right? But if I'm golfing and somebody's giving me data on statistics on, what to say on the outcome of a golf tournament, I can't use that to help me. So I think that there's often some incongruency between the data teams get and how they think they can use it. So I think that when I've seen data, when Curt, I happened to watch, is he brought some data to a team and kind of helped the team think about what is it we're trying to do and how does this data help us to make some decisions or change our interventions, or kind of looking at that. And oftentimes in organizations, those processes are not integrated. You need to do this assessment because I've got to get this information to this donor so that they see that we're doing something.
Yeah.
And people go, that's busy work for me. Right? And so, I think Curt has been really good at figuring out how to have the team involved in defining what it is we want to do, and then what is the data we need to do to collect to help us to make these decisions. That's a very different process than this kind of fragmented place. And that's what I've seen in organizations is there's an incongruency between what we're collecting and what we think we're actually doing.
Yeah, I like what you said, Jerry, about, I probably learned this from talking to you, or you challenging something that I thought about. How people think about things is a part of the context of your intervention, whether it's clinical intervention or an organizational change kind of intervention. And if your intervention does not match up with how they think about the problem, your intervention is not likely to work very well. And sometimes you have to really help people to think about the information you're giving them differently.
Right.
Sometimes we have data that's how the data that we collect, and maybe we don't want to collect anymore, right? Because there's effort involved in data collection, and there's always diminishing returns. The more data you collect, you may not get the return on the effort that you put into it. So we have to use the data we have.
Right. And you and I have talked about this. We're always collecting data.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, what's the weather outside and what's
you're writing it down or not.
How do I do? We're always collecting data, except I have to have some model in my head or collectively in my group to say is, what data are we actually looking for to make our decisions, right? And I think you said it, if I bring in data and I say to you, we're collecting this data for a grant, that's not very useful for my team. But if I say, here's some data on functioning, how do we best think about the way we're thinking, and can we use this data? That's a different way, and I think you have to train teams of how to begin to use data.
Yeah.
Not just give them data.
I remember a story, this was years ago when we very first started using heart rate with teams, and how do they think about the internal state of this child who they're treating based on their heart rate. And I remember having one psychologist who just wanted to argue with me about that. I mean, she just could not wrap her head around why we would use that, because she was saying that we were taking heart rate data at intake when they were really stressed out, so it was likely to be higher than normal anyway. And which is a valid argument. Like, there's nothing wrong with that argument. It's probably true. But without that data, we were going on less effective information than we were if we used it, even though it may have been elevated. So before, and I think, Jerry, I think you made this point to me when we were talking about it. You're like, well, what was the information you're using before you had the kid's heart rate? Nothing. Well, a little bit of data is better than no data. Like if you have a way of understanding it and a way of using it and a way of putting it into a context, but getting people it took us some time for sure, and a lot of discussions about what does this measure of heart rate mean, and what is it indicative of, and we had to train on like all of the things that we've talked about in our other episodes about heart rate variability and cognitive function and the stress response and the way that we organize ourselves to deal with demands and all of those things tied to this one measure. But as we got people thinking about what the problems they were solving in that context, suddenly that data became really useful to everybody. It helped them to make decisions, and it also helped them to manage some of the affect that the kids' symptoms would generate for the staff. So that data really helped us a lot. But we had to go through the process of helping people to think about it in a way that was useful.
So I think for the discussion we're having today, the question is always, how in your trauma-informed teams that are going to look at what are the variables you want to look at? It's like this issue of safety. Right? When you're looking at safety and you're looking at policies and procedures and you're looking at the environment and you're looking at the classroom climate, when you're looking at what are the things you're going to look for that would be indication of safety, right? To kind of manage that. So I think that there are some things that we know that for our kids, so this child who you described as coming in with a high heart rate variability, high heart rate, right? The person who you were talking to assume that as soon as they leave this intake, their heart rate goes back down to normal and to do it, right? So they're assuming that capacity lies within that child, as opposed to we know this child is really frightened and overwhelmed. What do we need to do to change how we're introducing this child to our program? Mm-hmm. Right? So what are our policies and procedures about how we're meeting this child at the door, knowing they're in this state? That's two different ways of thinking about it, right? One is, once we're done with the intake, this child's going to relax and feel better about themselves. Right. The heart rate's going to go down. The other way would be what do we need to do to change how we're meeting this child? Right. So I think that's an interesting way of having the discussion in the team meeting. Is we have this little piece of data. What's our thinking about it? Mm-hmm. Right? I'm presenting this new material, and if the child doesn't get it, it's the child's fault. They have to kind of figure out, or how do we change the environment and what we do to help that child better be successful?
Right.
There's a good example of changing the way people think.
Yeah. And either one is a great direction to go, because it's generating the idea of clinical thinking, which is, what is our hypothesis about this data, and how are we going to get information about whether or not that hypothesis is correct or incorrect? And the next, right? So let's say that one was true, right? That heart rate was elevated at intake. Well, the only way we would know that is by the next measure, right? You got to take another data point to then the next data point helps you to give context to the previous one. Great. Now that maybe that was true. Maybe they were elevated during intake, and now it's back down, and that's how we understand that information.
Right. But if you think about our traditional model, say in a residential treatment center, the heart rate is elevated in intake. So you come in and you lose all your privileges, and you're in your room until you prove to us that you're doing. Right. Think about how we would change thinking about bringing that child into our treatment center.
Right.
Right? So again, is that one piece of data, and I'm not saying that we should adjust everything, but how do one person's thinking, oh, that's over, and to do it, other people are thinking, no, that's a good piece. It raises some underlying assumptions we're making about this child, mm-hmm. and how we structure our program.
Yeah. And certainly I would tie it back to, you got me thinking, tying it back to my example from yesterday, like managing conflict. My hope in that discussion that I had with that team is that they can now have a different context for when they feel conflict. And so that when they feel conflict, they can now think, oh, this is how we generate creativity. I can tolerate this affect. As opposed to, I feel conflict, there's a problem, we have to solve this right now, or I have to avoid it, or I have to do something to get away from this. And having a different way of thinking about it can help them to stay in that discussion longer and communicate better.
Yeah.
Right.
The old way of thinking about that, of really becoming conflict avoidant, or that conflict is inherently bad and means that we're doing something wrong when we have conflict, means that we don't communicate anymore.
Right. So
certainly a hope.
really, underneath all these interventions are belief systems and values and perceptions.
Yeah.
And I think that in this double loop kind of process, we don't just change our interventions. We really have to look at what are our underlying assumptions, and how did those assumptions drive policies, drive our procedures, drive our disciplinary processes. I think that's why these teams have to really spend a lot of time not just looking at the things to do, but what are our beliefs that are driving us to do things differently.
Well, and to try to I mean, one of the big things in residential that we talk about with trauma is decreasing seclusions, locked door, quiet room, and restraints. A great way to lower your seclusion or quiet rooms is put padlocks on the door. All of a sudden,
Right.
your seclusions are going to drop to zero, and your dad is going to look really good because it's no longer an option. And your staff, though they may quit en masse if you don't give them other skills, they will find other skills eventually to replace that. So I think that those values, those principles are such a key thing. Why are we doing this? Make sure you communicate that, so you just don't put a padlock over a real life, because then your restraints might jump way up. Again, now you could go to your grantee and say, look, our seclusions have gone to zero, and yet your outcomes might be terrible as well.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to wrap up with maybe a too loaded question, but I would love to get your thoughts if you could identify one. Let's say universally, whether you're talking to a police office, a police department, a school, a early childhood education, all these different folks who are trying to become trauma informed. Can you pick any universal measures? Now, whether it's working with a police department or an early childhood education, a library staff, all these different, very diverse settings, would you suggest, even though it might look a little different, but are there any universals that we would, no matter where you would go, you say this would be a measure that would give you some indication that your journey is being successful?
Matt, I think that there are measures out there, and I'm not an expert on all these measurements. First of all, I want to start with that. But there's measurements that look at attitudes and beliefs behind trauma-informed principles. Mm-hmm. So we would measure whether people's attitudes and beliefs changed. Yeah. There are measures you can get to that. There are measures that look at practices. So are these practices in place or aren't these practices in place? And so I think that I would start by saying, what do we want to change? Mm-hmm. Right? What do we want to change? And then look for the measure that kind of matches that. There are, say, for example, in the sanctuary model, are these rituals being conducted on a consistent basis in our organization?
Yeah.
So I think you have to spend some time as a organization defining what it is you're trying to get to. Some people use the SAMHSA. There's those 5 or 6 definitions of safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, peer support, empowerment, and cultural and historical trauma. So, and then they look at and define the data that they're going to look to kind of manage that. So there's a lot of ways of concretely going, but I would start with what matches us. So, in one organization, where Curt worked, we used sanctuary, commitments to kind of organize this kind of approach to it. Another one is, under, say, in Dr. Perry's looking at, neurosequential models. What are we looking at? Regulation issues. What are we looking at? Relational issues. What are we looking at? Competency issues that we're teaching people to kind of looking at some of those things. And are we doing it? So what is the organizing model you're using to move to trauma-informed care or trauma-sensitive education? And then what are the measures that are going to help us to get there? As opposed to going out and getting a measure and then having us organize around the measure.
So, but would there be an area, and I don't disagree with you, but I'm just looking if, no matter where you're at, you would want to measure this. Now, the tool might be different, but you would want to measure, and it's okay to say no to this question too, because I think that to me is probably, I have an idea, but it's, would there be anything, hey, we would want to get this across all different platforms and industries?
There's nothing that could happen. There's no learning.
I can't think
There's no exploration. There's no relating if people don't feel safe.
Yeah.
So whatever measure you're measuring, it has to have a component of looking at this issue of physical, psychological, social, and moral safety.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about kind of extending, Jerry, what you're saying about some measures are about, when we talk about attitudes and beliefs, and some are about practices. I think if I were, as I think about these kind of things, I always try and strike some kind of balance between measuring attitudes and beliefs and actually measuring what people do. Mm-hmm. And I tend to put a little bit more balance on what people do. And really the literature is that attitudes and beliefs follow what we do more than what we do follows our attitudes and beliefs. Right? There's pretty good literature about that. And so I tend to measure things like, what do people do? But you can have so many measures like that, thinking about, back to thinking about if you want your restraints and your seclusions to go to 0, right? I mean, how we thought about that in so many organizations is that restraints and seclusions were indicative of something that we did wrong. Either the kid did it wrong or we did it wrong. And as we got more and more into being trauma sensitive and trauma responsive, what we thought about is that restraints and seclusions were indicative of organizational stress. And then we started thinking about, what do we need to do to reduce stress more than what do we need to do to just reduce restraints and seclusions, right? Which leads you to different things than putting a lock on the door. Mm-hmm. Right? You need a different intervention when you thought about it differently. And so I think that's as universal as I could probably get.
I think the one universal that I have identified, and it's a little bit, it's a swerve around a turn and back, but I think it, at the same time, maybe the most critical piece of data is, and again, you could use different measures to get this, is I'd want some sort of measure on the wellness of staff, whether you use the professional quality of life survey or, there's a lot. I like the Gallup employee engagement because I think it measures a lot of, you can get some safety ideas out of there. But the one thing that I would look at is that if we come in and you're at the beginning of this journey and you're staff satisfaction or staff safety, those sort of measures. I think one of the data sets I want people to look at as any part of their journey is the wellness and engagement of their workforce. Because I think if you've got a burned out or traumatized workforce, then don't go to policies and procedures. That you're just setting yourself up for a really big headache. And so how do we work with leadership? How do we work with around self-care? And in some ways, I think it's nice to set that out as part of this, because it helps. This isn't trauma-informed or trauma-responsive isn't just what we do for someone else. It's how we interact with each other and how we operate as an organization as well. So, and all my thinking about this and trying to have a really nice elevator speech when people say, okay, how are we going to measure our success? Again, across industries, I think that's a nearly impossible thing to answer. I think we can look at concepts, but they're all different. The police is going to do very different than a library. But I think the wellness of the workforce is the one universal that I would kind of throw out there that I've come across.
As we had this discussion, it's clear that our underlying belief systems drove what we measured.
Yeah.
Right? Is that I think that all of these issues are right? Is what you do drives your assumptions. What your assumptions drive what you do. Your wellness drives the kind of looking at. What's clear is that you could start in a number of places, but you have to have you and your team have to have some discussion around what do we believe and why. So if you believe that having a healthy staff is going to drive them to make better decisions and kind of tolerate, that's a good place to start. If you believe measuring what we're actually doing is a good indication of what our real true underlying beliefs are, then that's a good place to start looking. There's a lot of literature that talks about, what drives us is our unconscious bias, right? And how do we get to people really what's really truly what they believe and what they do versus what they say they do and kind of looking at. So I think it's important to have a starting point, but even this discussion, if we were in a meeting, how would we decide? We have 3 different ways of looking at this, so they're all valid. What would we decide, right? Is that we'd have to say is, what's important to us right now, and how do we take wellness from what people do to kind of help us look at how do we integrate what we're saying in here? And I think that's what's going to happen for organizations. People are going to come in with very different, all valid perspectives. How do we as a team have a place to go? Is ultimately what we want is a safe place where people have a voice, where people have a choice, and that people learn how to solve problems in a nonviolent way, right? Is that we can hold each other's experience and come up with a solution to this. That's what I think. That's what's so nice about this discussion today. They're all valid, and I think really we could start any place.
Yeah. And I think what I really, I thought this would be one episode, and it turned into 3. I think we could have a whole nother episode on this data and quality thing, which I won't put. It's more me being a nerd probably than what anybody else would want to listen to. But I really, what I hope people take away from the last 3 weeks has been, this is complex. So I would be very cautious of any trainer where you ask, oh, what do we measure? And they hand you a 2-page handout. That is where I think we want that. I want that. I would love if somebody wrote a book that had a universal implementation plan for every entity that would want to consider bringing this research in. But I don't think that's a realistic thing. Now, a manual might give us a structure in which to guide our conversations, but this is really hard. And even 2 organizations doing the exact same work, but doing it in slightly different ways, might have a process that looks totally different. So
right.
I think at the end of the day, any process worth taking, any journey worth taking needs to be well planned out, well thought out, well resourced. And you, again, just know that you're not going to become trauma informed after a half-day training.
So one of the things to leave today is because you started out saying we want to be a little concrete, right? Is in a lot of schools, what drives their current models is a positive behavioral system, right? Is that how do you take that system that's already in place and look at it from a trauma-informed lens? What would, if teams could get together and talk about what is the ways that we would take our current model that's organizing us and now look at it from a trauma-informed perspective? And I think that there's a lot of measurements in a positive behavioral system that are already there, that the data is already there, but we have to look at it from a different perspective. And I know, Curt, you've done some thinking about this, but I don't want people to think that, okay, we just got to stop doing everything we're doing. How do we now take some of the data we already have, nurses visits, expulsions, suspensions, and look at it from some of these trauma-informed perspectives and integrate it. And there are some good resources out there that can begin to help us to look at that. So I think that that's a really nice way that when I've gone into places, people either think you have to do, this positive PBIS or you have to do trauma-informed. Yeah. There's an integration of these things.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. I think that's a great end note. Great discussion. Actually, Jerry's going to the East Coast next week. I'm going to the West Coast, and we found no time to meet in between. So we're going to take a week off next week, and the week after we'll continue talking about leadership. I don't think we've by any ways exhausted this topic whatsoever. So thanks for taking the journey. As always, you can find show notes, discussion questions at traumainformedlens.org. I will also put a link to the starting point of my recent blog series about really some of the details and points that I like to have people think about when they're creating these teams, and a way to think about how your current teams operate as well. So everybody have a good couple weeks. Hopefully when we get back, the Nuggets are in the Western Conference Finals, and the three of us are really happy. So great as always, gentlemen, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.